I slept some.
Janie, for your purposes in recording, microphones would be helpful?
Yes. They're being recorded.
Very good. And I think they're organized now so you can turn them on and we don't stumble over one another, I think. But
On, you mean?
you can if you'd like. Everything you say will be heard. But please turn it on when you do speak for the meeting. But I'd like to call our work session to order. And I appreciate everyone being here, and I'm mindful, I may say it again later, when we sat down to do this budget, it was, we were close to looking at a budget, and then COVID hit, and we drastically changed the budget. So it's an interesting year, and look forward to reviewing it, and bounce past to Jen.
Yes, Jen's going to take this.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. And it was interesting to hear you say that you were close to having a budget done and then COVID, so you had to make an immediate change, because as far as I can tell, you guys were pretty spot on with your changes you made. It really looks like the fourth quarter tracked to budget. We did have some unexpected surprises in a good way, in that the revenue growth for particularly meals, lodging, and sales taxes were much ahead of the budget. And I do understand from listening to some of your past meetings that you did budget downward in those categories because of COVID. But we were up in sales 44% over the budget, meals 52%, and lodging 33%. Then another great category were the building permits, which more than doubled what you all had budgeted. The one category that I know Jake had pointed out to you time and again, in the revenue side that fell behind was, of course, the interest earning, because nobody's earning interest right now, and it's just sad. But thankfully, that's only about 1.6% of the general fund's total revenue, so it didn't impact us that badly.
Jen, you want questions along the way or at the end? Or do you have a
However you guys prefer to do it.
I was just going to say, with the permits, were there any extraordinary applications in the past year?
There was, and I forget the name of the project,
Okay.
but I remember talking to Steve Polk about it. I want to say, was it one of the universities had a big project?
Washington Lee chronically has big projects, and if I remember correctly, VMI is exempt from building permits. But
Okay.
Washington Lee, we probably collected.
Yeah, the only one that comes to mind, of course, is the Aquatic Center, VMI, but you're right, they're exempt. I'm trying to think of what else is that big.
The gym, I mean, the Washington Lee's gym, or was that the year before?
I think that was the year
Yeah,
before.
I believe so.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
We can check and get back to you, of course.
Yeah, I will, for sure.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay. We also saw a dramatic increase in federal funding this year with both the CARES funding and then the first tranche of the ARPA funding. All of the CARES funding has been expended, and none of the ARPA funds have yet. So they'll be part of our carryover discussion later on in the evening. So really, most of the expenses also tracked in line with budget, with the exception being our contributions to leisure services, which, like some of the revenues, you guys had already reduced what we were expecting to spend, but we ended up spending even less. The other exception is Public Works, the State Street Maintenance category. They were able to expand the scope of the paving projects due to carryover from FY20, so that ended up spending a little bit more. So, any questions on the general fund side?
I'm going to back up under recovered costs. I'm not missing it. This category ended the year at 84% of budget,
Yes.
And it said, this is largely due to the lower than budgeted fire and rescue settlement payment due. And I read
Right.
that 3 or 4 times, and I'm not sure what that means.
Gotcha. Thank you for saying that. So what I was describing here is a portion of the CARES funding was directly used to cover the salaries of our firefighters and EMTs.
Okay.
And so we then reduced, we didn't charge Rockbridge County for free money that we had essentially.
Gotcha. Okay. So what we charged them was reduced.
Exactly, by the
so
amount of the
anybody-
CARES funding that we were
Okay.
able to use, exactly.
Excellent.
How much did we charge, how much less did we charge them than that was contractually obligated?
I think that it was a reduction of maybe 129,000. And I did look at the contract today, and there is a stipulation in there where any funds that we are reimbursed by the federal or state government, we're not allowed to charge them for. So I think it kind of falls into that category.
Right, and so since we decided to allocate our funding a certain way, which we didn't have to, we then saved the county $129,000?
Correct.
Okay.
If I may, I believe we had to do it in areas that were open to reimbursement, and that was one of the big areas was public safety, that we could easily do it. The other ones would have had to been directly related to care, like healthcare cost, COVID, I should say, healthcare costs, changes in buildings that would have been, made for air circulation or something like that. We tried to recover everything we could on those areas, and because they were needed, and sometimes you could make air exchange improvements that were necessary anyway, and we just couldn't do it. We had to put a lot of that into public works, public safety. We had nowhere else to put it.
Yeah, I don't think there's any objection to that. It's just the windfall we share with our neighbors as opposed to hoarding is, I think, your point.
Yeah, I think it's excellent.
Okay.
I mean, but just that we acknowledge that the county was charged $129,000 less because of our allocation of the CARES Act funds. So similarly, if the county used CARES Act funds for operations at the high school as opposed to an elementary school, then they shouldn't charge us the full amount, contractually speaking, to operate the high school, if that were to happen. I'm just making the point again. I think everyone gets the point. It's just important, it's worth noting, and it's transparent to the taxpayers.
All right, shall I move on to the school fund or any other thoughts on the general fund?
So to follow up on Mr. Ziegler's comment there, do we have the bills from the county for the high school yet? For the what we normally pay, has it been reduced?
I don't know the,
I was going to say, I'll let Leslie address that because she was the most recent school board chair. Or affirm this, we have our assessment and then pay on a monthly basis for the subsequent year. So we're paying for, last year we were paying for 2020.
So if there's any recovery, it'll be to come later,
Would anticipate it in
and it'll just be reduced, the monthlies next year will be reduced probably.
probably.
Yeah.
That would be an expectation. I'm not sure how they're, good question for our school board, but how that's getting dealt with or how the additional funding, how it's impacted the operations of the high school.
Yeah, so I thank Mr. Ziegler for raising the point.
Yeah. And I'll be sure to ask the county finance how they've done that. If there's anything in that expense to the high school that would have been CARES oriented or was CARES funded, that then was reducing expenses that otherwise would have incurred.
Lots of money flowing. Thank you, ma'am.
thank you. On the school fund, they also tracked very close to budget. They ended with their revenues slightly ahead of budget at 104%. Like the city, they saw an increase in their federal funding this year from their CARES Act funding allocation. And their expenses were also very closely in line with budget, ending at 101% of budget. And of course, we can see that the additional costs were offset by those additional revenues.
Jen, in the federal revenues, or the CARES Act, does that show up in the federal categorical?
Yes, sir.
So amended budget 296. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions on the schools?
No, ma'am.
In the utility fund, so in order to get a true snapshot of the year, I did accrue back the July receipts because those largely represented usage in the month of June. So when we look at this, let's see, sorry. So as you all discussed in prior meetings, we did see a decrease in consumption in the second quarter. But during the third and fourth quarters, we were able to make up some good ground, although at the end of the year, we fell just short of budget at 93%. The expenses overall were low and only came in at 53%. However, this was largely due to the capital projects at Diamond Hill, which have been deferred to fiscal year '22. So excluding that category, expenses were at 98% of budget. The wastewater operations were a significant source of expenses, finishing the year at 121% of budget. And we believe that's due to the significant amount of precipitation we had January through March. Any questions?
Can you speak to our methodology with utility funding? We used to chart or send bill every 2 months, and we've gone to 1 month. It's been a little over a year, I think, or maybe a year and a half. How is that working cash flow wise, or any issues from the treasurer's office, or?
Not that I'm aware of. Since I came here, it was already at this new method, and I haven't heard complaints. And from my perspective, it helps keep cash flowing each month.
Good.
From one perspective, it's easier to track the usage by customers. They don't have to wait 2 months to get their bill and find out that they've got a leak or they've got some problems. They know after 30 days approximately that, wow, the usage is up. So that's been helpful on the one hand because, they're able to see that. We're also able to track, the usage so we can detect if there's any large losses in water. Like we had over VMI, that large leak. Sometimes you get those leaks, and if they go on for a certain amount of days, obviously that's not good for us either. That's unmetered. We see it and look and say, wait a minute, we didn't sell enough water. Where did it go to? It didn't show up in our revenues. We bought it from the MSA, so it disappeared somewhere underground. We got to look at that.
Right.
So there's some real advantages. Mm-hmm.
That was the intended outcome, to be sure. You mentioned, or I think I heard you say, with the reporting, if we see somebody with high usage, we're able to contact them. Is that happening consistently from your perspective, or?
We do it, but not all the time. But even the customer can see, of course, as well.
Right.
We don't make it a point to do every 100%, and we can't do 100% because some of the meters don't read electronically still. It's just they're not going to be able to do that based on the location of the individual customer and how we read and get that information. I don't know the technology exactly, but it's radio signal or some type of a signal, if you will.
Right. I mean, I can go check my water usage each day and see, do we wash clothes, or is there justification for it? But that's because I've signed up for the portal. I hope that one of the things we talked about in the past was making sure that we're making customers aware so that they can get alerts.
Yes.
As we do.
Yes. It has been in the bill several times. Anyone who requests a reduction, we tell them they have to sign up for the portal before we give a reduction. Won't even consider it until they sign up. Doesn't mean they're going to use it next month, but at least they've signed up.
Right. Thank you. Mr. Allegan.
With regard to water, there were a couple issues on billing. for certain customers that had excessive water use this past summer during the really hot days and whatnot. And part of the resolution, as my understanding, was that they were accommodated in that if it was watering gardens, for example, then it didn't use the sewer, and therefore, and looking at my bill, it's like 2-to-1 the ratio for those kind of things. But the bill for one of them was over $1,000 in there to do that. And so to follow up, were they on the portal? And if they were, then were they notified that there was this excessive use beyond that? Or did it just catch everybody by surprise?
My belief is they were not on the portal because they were surprised. So if they were on it, they weren't using it, but they certainly weren't looking in either case. Again, we don't necessarily track every customer out there. Some of them we do find that there's an extraordinary usage. You know, from what I've been told by Jeff, basically it's not something that we go through on a weekly basis if you want to look at that. We just don't know. We always have the time for that every week to go through all those accounts.
Well, I thought excuse me, but I thought that one of the reasons for having this computerized issue was to be able to have a computer automatically do a percentage calculation. Once the percent got above a certain thing, then it would turn a flag. That's what I thought was supposed to be happening with the documentation with our computer billing system for our water meters.
I'll have to check that. I didn't reach that conclusion myself. It makes sense, but I did not hear or understand that to be the case.
Yeah, and I thought I remember Mr. Kennedy, when he was here, talking about how great this was going to be, because you could look at percentage gain, because you could do it by the minute or however frequent the water meter did its transmission of data and whatnot to do that. And so for these particular customers that had over $1,000 or whatnot in there, maybe we could have caught that if we had just printed a flag. And when you print a flag, we're not printing a flag for 3,000 customers, we're printing a flag for the ones that get flagged.
Well, you know, one of the things that's come up before is if you leave your window open during the winter and your heater blows and blows and blows and blows, there's no one from the energy company.
Oh, that's right, that's different, that's
And,
different.
and
That's right.
it's not different, it's still a utility.
That's right.
But because it's local, people can come and beat on the city manager as opposed to, you know, contacting Dominion and Bark or whomever
Yeah, leave the
supplying.
window open. But they
So-
were watering garden, that's my understanding.
Right.
in there to do
Well,
it.
I'm under the impression, again, from when we bought into this system, that there was called a heavy usage report, or if your water was running 24 hours a day, we all know that that's a faucet left on or something of that nature.
Early,
And that there's a daily report that says, you know, here are the households that had 24-hour or, you know, spike in usage out of the ordinary. And staff could be able to call. My sense is just the way things are, short-staffed and what have you, we're not making that call. So some people are upset, but we're under no obligation. It's really a favor and a kind gesture by the city.
We're not under an obligation, I agree with that.
Correct.
And-
So, but it is a shocker when you get a $500 or $1,000 water bill because you left your hose on or you got a leaky toilet or something of that nature. And again, the best part is, now that we're doing monthly billing, we're aware.
Yeah, you don't see it after 2 months, that's right. In there, but because it's computerized, it's not hard for a computer to calculate a difference.
It's not, but you can only do so much with the data with your staffing. So,
I can certainly look
all
into
there.
it. The point is good, and, you know, we're not opposed to trying to save the customer money, but, you know, there really are literally dozens of overflows, if you will, overuse each month, dozens. I mean, probably 5 to 10 get to my desk because they're significant, and Jeff and Stephanie and Public Works are doing dozens every month. That's without notifying anybody. And, you know, again, what level? 10%, 20%, a lot of people's very routinely.
And what's great is everyone has the opportunity to take personal responsibility and track their own water every
Being on the
day,
portal. Sure.
at the every day.
Right, I agree.
And so they don't need to wait for someone else to do it for them. We've provided everyone the tools to do it themselves.
Right, right.
Yes, and even with having the tool, I don't know how they make the distinction, but with a high usage business like the apartment complex, there were times when they would come with a report to say, we've got excessive usage in such and such an area and particular meter. And it was to give us an opportunity to troubleshoot, because what was happening was something was going on between 2 and 4 a.m. in the mornings that nobody could really figure out what was going on. And, they were working with us to help us to determine what that was, and it has slacked off, and it's not happening anymore, so. But
So they never did figure it out?
We never figured it out, and it was nothing with our infrastructure at all. It had to do with whatever tenant was doing something odd between 2 and 4 a.m. I mean, we've even gone down there at night to just try to listen. And yet there's a stethoscope that you can use to check and see if the water's coming through the lines. And we've even done that, but we just, couldn't determine what was going on.
And when you say we, that was the apartment complex, not the city of Lexington.
The apartment complex staff. No, city wasn't out there at night helping us out with that.
It was the apartment paying the bill.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. Business space.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you. Okay, so lastly, moving on to the equipment replacement fund, revenue finished strong at 97% of budget. The only line item that did not meet budget was the surplus equipment sales. On the expense side, we were able to purchase all of the equipment that was budgeted with the exception of the compressed air filler. It was delayed until September, but the fire department does have that now, and we've paid for that in FY22.
And that was like 50,000, something like that.
Yeah, 53,000 and some change.
Very good. Any questions from council? Very good.
Should I move on to the first quarter of '22?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm pleased to report that the first quarter of fiscal year '22 reflects revenues and expenses that are generally in line with expectations. You'll see revenues at only 13% of budget in the general fund. However, this is due just to the timing of our taxes. And so I suspect by the end of quarter two, we'll be at a much higher level. Overall expenses are tracking at around 29% of budget, with the only real outlier being the expenses on the State Street maintenance. However, this is due to expanding the scope of the paging projects, and again, will be paid for with the large carryover amount that we'll talk about later. So it's still very early in the year, but are there any questions on the general fund? The school fund is also right on track for the year, with both revenues and expenses coming in at approximately 22% of their budgeted. Any questions on the schools?
Just a reminder, are they still on the hold harmless on their attendance?
That was my understanding from the meeting we had with them a couple weeks back.
Okay.
Yes. Okay.
That is correct, too. I had to connect that in my mind when you said that, but yes, they're still working with the state revenues that otherwise would be there if all the students were in place before COVID.
Right. Nice opportunity and to have that consistency.
Especially since it's higher than the actual
Indeed.
population of the schools.
So moving on to the utility fund, they also seem to be on track for the year. As I mentioned earlier in the year-end report, I accrued back the July receipts into June so we could get a clear 12-month picture for FY21. In going over my materials earlier today, I realized I failed to do that with the October receipts to get a good picture of Q1 in FY22. Had I remembered to do that, though, we would see that we're actually at 28% of budget in the revenue side. So that's actually really good news. On the, oh, sorry?
28 versus 19.
Exactly,
Very good.
yes. The total expenses for the utility fund are running at about 20% of budget, with water operations expenses running a little bit high at 31%. So that is an area that we continue to watch, and I know Public Works is always watching that.
Just to note, as we've seen in the wet times of year, that the wastewater is up, and you can see actually wastewater expenses are down now because it's been so dry this last quarter of the year, this first quarter of the current year. You know, July, August, September, what did we get? We got the one big rain, but other than that, we had almost nothing. So it's good at this point.
Okay, so moving right along to the equipment replacement fund, revenues are tracking right in line with our budget expectations. Expenses are currently showing at 42% of budget. However, this is somewhat skewed due to that compressed air filler I mentioned was paid for in FY22 as opposed to 21. And then further, I will be coming back to council at your next meeting with the budget amendment to allocate the $800,000 that you approved at your last meeting to go toward the ladder truck replacement. Any questions on first quarter?
Don't think so.
Sorry, so even with that big dump of rain we had that overwhelmed the waste treatment facility, we're still coming out under budget relatively at waste treatment.
That is
That's what I read.
accurate. The only question I can't remember off the top of my head is what month that storm actually happened in. So this is expenses we received through the end of September.
So would we be billed for that in the first quarter, or would we be billed for that in the second quarter?
I will need to check on that and get
Okay.
back to you. I don't know.
It was in September, I
Was it?
recall that.
Okay.
So I would assume it was budgeted or billed in the first quarter.
Okay. Would you mind double checking that?
Not a problem.
Okay. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Along those lines, can you comment on when we do get the billing for that? Is it a month in arrears or 2 months or?
So we just last week paid the bill for the first quarter to the MSA for both water and the wastewater. And so I believe it was for the first quarter,
So we,
quarterly.
that's a quarterly payment that we
Yes.
make. Interesting.
Correct.
Which would imply we haven't gotten the bill for the big rain.
It would imply we did because we just got billed in October, so they would have had their sales for the entire month of September.
The first quarter is July, August, September.
Right,
Right,
and we were just billed a week or two ago.
right. I will still confirm, but I believe that's correct.
Is it accurate that we still have about double-digit job openings within the city? I mean, just even looking at the website, it advertises about 4 public works positions. We know about the police officer shortage, someone in the commissioner of the revenue office, there's a vacancy there, and then we're advertising for a firefighter medics. I mean, it adds up to 11, it seems. So is that also contributing to our budget situation, to have that many vacancies?
At this juncture, it probably contributes a little bit, of course, because we have had several vacancies for several months. So the expenditures are down a little bit. I wouldn't say that's absolutely correlates, because you do have some of those folks, if they've been here for long term, are also getting paid out 2 or 3 months of leave as well. So sometimes, in fact, that payout is pretty significant. You know, if you've only been here 3 years, you don't have much leave, but if you've been here 25 years and you're retiring or going to another job, then sometimes they've been very prudent in saving a lot of leave, and we pay for it. So, but yes, we are still seeing some significant turnover. We lost 2 positions in Public Works just this week. I think we actually have 8 vacancies there now. The entire refuse crew is gone. So, you know, we just move people from the roads and right away and cemetery crews to pick up garbage.
I don't know if y'all want to talk about that at all, but obviously we, professionally, a lot of conversations I've had with small business owners is that they're having to pay more. The $15 minimum wage is not passed, is not law of the land, but it's the practice of the land at this point. And many entry-level places are starting people at $15 an hour, and I think hours are probably around $11 or $12 an hour. And I think the 2 refuse workers that left took jobs paying $14 an hour, which certainly adds up over time, and as a percentage, I don't need to lecture you all on the numbers, but somehow I think we have to look at, I know we've got the compensation study underway, and that's going to help. I don't know if you can give us an update or some expectations on that, but that's just a grim reality that we need to work towards paying our people more. It's just the market in general, whether it's police, fire, public works, et cetera. It's just more expensive. So,
We hope to have results of the study in January. We've been discussing it with the Berkeley group who's doing the work for us, put a schedule in place, and we've, the receivables are there. What we're supposed to get out of the report have been agreed to, so I don't look at the timetable enough to know if they're starting this week or 2 weeks from now, but they're ready to go.
and when you get it in January, obviously it'll be a priority for staff to look at that, perhaps have some recommendations as early as February.
My intent was to build whatever we found into the budget for it in July that you'd be seeing for July of '22, the '23 budget.
Right.
You know, just like police, I guess we could find ourselves in a position in a couple months where we have to act now because we can't fill the public works in particular positions. Scott did, Dameron did contact Robbie and say, you know, I need help because I'm not sure if we have snowfall, if I can push the snow and put salt on the roads. I just won't have enough people if this continues.
Right.
Now, you can say we've had really good winters recently and we won't worry about it too much, but, you know, this would be the year we didn't when we got 8 or 10 vacancies in January, and, you know, here we are. So we're watching it carefully, but we don't know what to expect.
Right.
So, and in terms of DPW, they drive trucks. And doesn't all of those, doesn't all of the truck drivers need CDL, commercial driver's licenses to drive those trucks in there? And so that's a certification process. And I remember talking with Mr. Martone about the process of getting people certified being a problem over time and whatnot. So you have to, it's something that the city's constantly having to deal with. And so if all the refuse workers, you know, there were CDL licensed people in that refuse crew in there to do it. So DPW, I don't know how many there are, but I think if everybody's got to be able to drive a snow pushing truck, you know, they've got to have a CDL. And so we're hoping for no snow.
Yeah. Well, not all of our people do drive the trucks or have a CDL. Some of the folks are just, we have like a refuse 1 position and a refuse 2, and refuse 2 usually are the drivers, and refuse 1 are the guys that ride in back. And the same thing is true with our construction crews. You know, you have the people that are down in the trenches and the people who operate the trucks, and usually that's just a higher grade. But But you're right, we still have the same problem. CDL licenses, if you want to go somewhere because of the shortages in the supply chain and drive a truck, you can probably find a pretty good job. I'm not sure if the truck, everyone qualifies for that for any number of reasons, but CDL licenses, like a lot of certificates, are valuable today.
Jim, how much is the compensation study expected to cost?
We're looking at between 12 and 15,000. And just as an FYI, we've extended it to Ralro, the Tourism Center, and the 911 Center if they wanted to participate, and they've all said they would participate.
Any other questions for Jennifer? Anything else to present?
No, thank you.
I'm trying to locate what I was looking at earlier in the day, and I think it was had to do with our capital plan, what we were setting aside, and it detailed the, for instance, the school funds, some set aside for, it seems like high school. What page is that on?
It's a separate agenda item. It's this here, the carryovers.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I'm just trying to find it in here.
I'd be happy to share mine.
Thank you, ma'am. And I know, looking at, mainly seeking a reminder, for instance, we have reserved for future needs of 85,000, reserved for future capital needs, and then reserved for future high school. How do those get funded? Can you remind me?
I will have to check.
I guess I'm looking at my peers to
Okay.
remind me.
We decided that, and it was really for one year when there was surplus that we designated some for, the school board used to have just reserves, and
Right.
it typically went to capital, but they could use it for anything. And then one session, we had a discussion on it and decided to allocate some with the high school expenses coming up. But I don't believe we're distributing it like that anymore.
Okay. Is that
What we passed was that half of their
surplus?
surplus
Yeah.
would go to future high school capital needs, and they got to then keep the other half of their surplus. And then, of course, we've also been putting in our budget money for future, our own CIP, we've been putting money in there for future high school capital needs.
But I think that had a stop date. I think that was for a short period. It wasn't ongoing that we were going
For us, that we were doing, or how they handled their dollars?
how they handle their dollars.
My understanding is that that there was not an end date on that
Division
That-
of the surplus
that
each year.
policy, that approach to how we would do that.
Yeah, I think, because there was concern that they weren't reserving for what may come down the pike at the high school, and to be prepared to either make a capital contribution, or if there's some type of emergency, there's some money reserved for that. And I don't remember there being an end date for that 50% of their surplus. I just remember, it's a cynical comment of the surplus may change, may not be as significant as it had been in years past, that it wasn't being divvied up or reserved. But I guess the reserve for future capital needs, is that arbitrary for, that they've set aside?
Yeah, I'm looking at that. That was the one, I think that was a one-time
Okay.
amount, was the reserve for future capital needs. And the future needs. I mean, yeah, it's, and it's fine to do. It's a little bit of, I feel like it's babysitting on our part. I mean, in the past, the school board's always been very responsible with it, and they do tend to use it for capital. It makes sense with the high school, because we were concerned about getting a big ticket at that point. But I think that's where that future capital needs came from. But I think that's the one, I don't think that is, well, Jen could tell us, but I don't think that's an ongoing division.
I believe you're correct. I think the only thing we still are doing is requiring them to put 50% into the high school reserve.
Yeah.
They may choose, as you say, to put some aside for capital. Talking with Rebecca, the superintendent, that's what I understand from time to time they've done to assure themselves it's there for some of those uses, and probably to assure you as well that they're being careful and good stewards.
I say my perception, at least when I read this, was that they may have earmarked, $81,000 for future capital needs because they had a specific purchase that they were going to do, so that money was spent but hadn't been dispersed yet, which that makes sense to me. The reserve for future needs had me scratching my head from, a bit of a savings account or slush fund, but I'm not sure.
Which the schools have had since you and I were on school board. There was always this fund. We didn't talk about it, we didn't use it, and it was all used for engineering designs for the new schools, and
Yeah.
it really went all towards that.
I was going to say, when you all went wild after I left and joined council, we didn't have that. Everything would just go back to the city for our surplus. It get negotiated by the superintendent and city manager for projects, but we usually zeroed out, is what I recall.
At some point,
Yeah.
they were
Well,
allowed to hold on to it for engineering costs in
Right.
design for schools.
Well, hopefully we don't have that now. Engineering costs and design. Very good. The other piece that I was going to just throw out on the table because we're looking at finances and looking at our dollars and cents, a lot of times people will suggest that your dollars are your priorities, so how we're spending our money, or in some instances, how we're not spending our money. We've obviously got a request for a contribution to a nonprofit coming up in our regular meeting. We zeroed out everybody last year when COVID hit for fear of just not having the funds and being very conservative. Somewhat drawing a line in the sand for most of those are ongoing, not one-time circumstances that we cut everybody off. Lime Kiln, Chamber, Yellow Brick Road, et cetera, outside agencies. But I don't know if y'all want to have a discussion or chat in work sessions to work on things. If there are things that you want to talk about or have strong feelings about relative to funding one-offs like the Hulls request, or projects that may be going on in the city, or things that we should be doing that we're not. So I've opened that door if anybody wants to speak to it. David?
Can I actually maybe come back to that? Because back to the high school. At our September 7th, 2017 meeting is when we talked about this. And at that time, we were planning to have annual debt service on HVAC project that'd be 200 and some thousand a year. I mean, and so NOAA, they were recommending a process that is probably worth looking at for our current team in City Hall, where we were going to be setting aside 50% of dollars until it's reached a certain threshold, this, that, and the other. So it's a little complicated. I can't even begin to summarize what the recommendation was. And then we would want to check the minutes from that meeting to see what we actually did vote and approve, because this was future school surpluses for debt service until the project, 175, I mean, it's NOAA. Yeah, NOAA had a plan.
Right, and we hit that cap. It was 175,000?
175.
Right.
So-
And I will say one more on the reserve for future needs. The other time when I was on school board, we did dip into that, was in 2009 when the recession hit. And we did for 1 year, knowing that we couldn't do it again, dip into that to balance our budget. I mean, I like the school having some reserves, and I think our school board has shown to be very prudent. I think it makes sense that we have some designated for the high school, but I trust our school board.
Sure. I do too.
I have a quick question about something else, but
Sure, please.
still related to money in there. What is, we get money from the county as part of the revenue sharing agreement there. I was wondering what level we're on track for this year. They told us what their numbers are yet?
I haven't seen that number yet. I think last year we received that payment in January, but I'd be happy to follow up with Steve Bolster to see if he has any indications for us.
It'd be helpful to have a kind of heads up on that number.
Absolutely.
Revenue sharing, yes, they're from the county.
But-
Ultimately, we're going to have a cap somewhere out there, and
We're not going to hit the cap.
we're not going to hit the cap in there.
Formula, we're not going to hit the cap.
All right, so we're not going to hit the cap. We still need to be interested to know how much it is.
Well, they budgeted it. It's in the budget as far as,
Yeah, Mr. Alligood, our finance department conspires with the Rockbridge County treasurer or finance director and come up with a budgeted number that's anticipated based upon the experience. Clearly, 2020 is an off year because of COVID. The trend may be a little bit different, but we do budget a fixed amount that the county does, and then they write a check for what the actual number is.
Right, after they know, right, after they get their receipts.
Correct,
Yeah.
correct. So if they get, have a bad retail sales experience or something of that nature, it's corresponding, but it's budgeted each year. So it's easily, that information's easily had. It's not anything different. In January, we always find out what the actual number is
Right.
or receive the check.
But generally, it's different each year.
Correct, correct.
but they're pretty close to budget this year.
Yeah. Because they work together and look at the numbers, they've usually been, what we budget and they budget usually comes pretty darn close.
Right, that's what I've seen.
And there aren't dramatic changes either. There really just aren't swings. Now, COVID, of course, was very different, but typically, the real estate taxes don't change. Sales taxes are about the same. People are spending their check on a regular basis, so you don't see too many changes in that
Right, I'm
figure.
not suggesting that there are.
No, I was just verifying. Mhm.
I just, that information's easily had.
It's right here.
Yeah.
Last year it was 1.9 million, and the prior year was 1.9 million.
Yeah, I was remembering somewhere around 2 million, but maybe I was rounding. Yeah, yeah.
And it took me a minute, but I did see what we budgeted for FY '22, and that's 1.9 million.
Very good. Other questions? Thoughts, concerns? Hearing none?
Well, if I may, Mr. Mayor,
Oh,
since
please.
there's no comments from City
Yeah.
Council, one of the things I'd like to do is get with Councilmember Strawn and Sigler and start looking at our ARPA monies again. On a broad basis, we'll get a recommendation to City Council as to how those should be spent. However, if we're starting to look at perhaps doing some actual capital projects, we do have a hard line of having to finish spending them at the end of 2024, which doesn't seem like seems like a long way away. But you're trying to engineer water and sewer projects is not that far away. So I'd like to sit down and start talking about specific uses and projects just to give staff guidance as to what we pursue. One of the thoughts I had was using that utility funds for the, that we set aside for utility, for the Jackson Avenue project. I mean, I think that in total, between phase 1 and phase 2, we're looking at around 13 million. And as you recall, we did borrow money for the Diamond Hill project where we had not anticipated doing so. We thought we could finance that with cash, but we found out we couldn't, somewhat because revenues are low and utilities just a little bit low each year based on our projections. And we've had other costs, of course, that we've, water usage and sewer in particular with the I&I, but lost water as well. That doesn't turn out to be revenue. So I'd like to look at that to see if, with the two of you, see if those are the areas we'd like to spend that money on or somewhere else, because You know, we have to start engineering those plans now and get moving to be able to put it in place in 2024. It's 2 years away.
With regard to the MSA money, let me restate that. With regard to MSA, they're proposing at this time approximately $20 million for improving the water plant, the drinking water plant. And if you say, well, the city's half is half and whatnot, so roughly 10. So that's going to be debt service on 10 for 20 years. I'm just suggesting it'll be a 20-year bond in there to do that. So there are other expenses that are coming up. That's only water treatment in there. And so we need to be considering that. And so would it be our practice to raise the rates to pay for all that? Or would it come out of general revenues? Or would it be a combination?
In the past, we've used our utility fund revenues, those revenues exclusively for utility fund expenses. And we've tried to fund all of our expenses with those revenues. So we have increased rates to make sure we pay for those expenses. You know, my belief is, and one of the things I'm going to be working with Jen on, is looking and projecting what rates could be based on debt service from MSA and projects like Jackson Street if we were to borrow again. And that's why I'm suggesting we may not want to borrow that all, because, you know, by the time you add the MSA debt, their operating increases, our debt, our operating increases, what will that look for the rate holder or rate payer 2 years, 5 years, 10 years out? I don't think it's something we'd like to see, probably, without running the numbers. So that's why I want to start that conversation. How do we use that money? And in the past, we've talked about I&I. Do we just fund that through the utility fund? I don't believe we can do that even under a debt situation, because that just adds more rate cost to our ratepayers. I'm thinking we're, you know, with those types of costs, whether it's I&I, the debt for the Diamond Street project, potential debt for Jackson Street, the potential debt that we're sure to see through the MSA, and then MSA operating increases, city operating increases. I don't think we want to add any more to our utility customers than we have to.
And I mentioned the water treatment only. There hasn't been any discussion yet about the money for the wastewater treatment, which is going to be a big ticket item as well, as yet unknown, but it'll still be not insignificant.
Before I call on David, I would answer your question, or the question I hear you asking. My response would be, it's intended to be an enterprise fund, and it should sustain itself. No funding from the general fund. And 7 or 8 years ago, I think it was, we set up the, can't remember the name of it, the Path for Success. And Davenport put together a terrific roadmap for replacing the infrastructure, predetermined rate increases along the way to pay for it, and all was take care of itself. Certainly there are factors that come into play, like a pandemic and reduced usage by Washington Lee and VMI when they closed up, that impact it negatively. But to answer your question, it's really intended for it to be an enterprise fund and all on its own, not to take from other components. But David.
My question was just going to be about the MSA and if the incentive, if they will have the incentive, or if it will be our responsibility to search out alternative means of funding. You know, you can look to neighboring jurisdictions. Everyone's facing water and sewer issues, and everyone's throwing around the numbers of $5-10 million just within a few miles of us and beyond. And a lot of folks, though, don't seem to be. They seem to have a lot of faith that they will receive grants, that they will receive money to help them, to soften the blow. And I haven't yet heard any of that we think we could potentially get grants. And so that's my question. Will it be MSA staff that is pursuing the grants when it is time to do that? Or if they're going to say, no, here's the bill. We got 2 customers. If you can figure out how to decrease your costs, you guys work on the grants and you guys be creative. And so I just, as we approach, that will be, if one person spent an entire year trying to find grants to pay for water and sewer, that would be well worth that person's time from the county and the city's point of view.
I will share that Spencer Suter and I have had that conversation already with Jordan about how we collectively look for those dollars. Whether they do or do not, the MSA spend time doing that, we will spend time doing that. I'm not going to leave it to chance. I was on a conference with the USDA on Appalachian Regional Commission funds. They've got a water environmental program where you can get grants and loans. Usually the grant is no more than 20% of the cost of the project. And there are income levels you have to meet. Of the statewide income average, you have to be, I want to say 80% or less to have what they call poverty, and that's 1% financing. 1.5% would be at the level, and anything above, at 80% that is, and anything above that, you get 2.2%. That's for the loan. Now, again, there are grants available. It's limited. They didn't say they could fund everyone. We're certainly going to look at it. In fact, I sent something to Spencer today. Brandy Flint from the county was on that conference call with me. So was the young lady from Buena Vista. Frankly, Buena Vista, these programs are made for communities like Buena Vista. Now, we're going to take our shot at it if we can, so yes, we're looking.
And I would say historically, where there are state and federally mandated upgrades that are generally unfunded, they'll eventually bring around the funding. And I can't help but think, maybe I'm just too optimistic, the infrastructure bill that's being debated, some of the funds will come from that for something like this for localities to improve their water system. So there's opportunity, I think, but exactly what it looks like, I'm not sure. So.
Well, at the pace that MSA seems to do things, I would be looking at this large expenditure in the next fiscal year in there, getting things lined up this fiscal year, but the actual funding would be 23.
At the pace USDA goes, we have to start talking now to them.
Right.
That would be from our rep on the MSA, so at the pace of the organization with the board's provocation. So.
That's right.
Before we adjourn the work session, I would just want to offer a particular thank you to Jen. Welcome, and thanks for tidying up 2021, which is a wild year, and I'm sure we'll be talking about it for years to come, not because of your good work, but because of the chaos with it. But thank you for making the numbers make sense and keeping track of everything after Jake's departure. Also wanted to say thank you to council for the quick response and the sound budgeting that you did last year as we were figuring out what was going to happen in COVID. And hard to believe we're masked up now, where February of 2020 we weren't. And how things have changed dramatically. And also a thank you to our community for the number of people who have responded and shopped local, keeping our sales revenue and keeping our restaurants, if you will, active and busy and employed in really, really difficult times. So with that, unless there's anything else for this, we will adjourn the work session and crank up once we get the table set.
For a long time, yeah.